Hello, my friends. My name is Darin Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide you with context in the war in Ukraine. In this video, I want to talk about Ukrainian weapons being allowed to strike into Russia. So this is a big push, and I can feel the pressure mounting both in Europe and the United States. It started a few weeks ago when David Cameron was first saying, this was again just a couple weeks ago, Ukraine can strike inside Russia with British weapons. And the Russians were not happy about that. And the Russians started talking, saber rattling back. And then you saw this. Ukraine asks the US to lift a ban on using American arms to strike at Russian territory. And this was May 15th. It's May 23rd as I'm recording this video now. And then you saw other things like the chairman of the French Foreign Affairs Committee, this was just a few days ago, of the National Assembly, demands that France change its doctrine and no longer prohibits Ukraine from striking inside Russian territory. So there's like one thing after another, but David Cameron's the one that broke the dam, and now it's easier for other nations to start asking for this. Okay, so the next thing that happened was that Secretary Blinken goes to Kyiv, and when he's in Ukraine and sees what's happening in Kharkiv, he starts to change his tune, it sounds like. He says something like, well, our policy is this, but, who are we to tell, and this is a paraphrase, we can't really tell Ukraine what they can do with the weapons once they have them. Then after that, there were 3 messages day after day after day. This was the third of them where they say our policy hasn't changed. The day before it was Lloyd Austin and the day before it was somebody else. We are focused on providing Ukraine with capabilities that it needs to defend itself within its own sovereign territory. So if they run back across the border into Russia, you can't hit it with our weapons, but they can hit you, which seems patently unfair. Okay, then there was a bipartisan group of 13 U.S. Congress members led by U.S. House Intelligence Chairman Mike Turner sent a letter to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to allow Ukraine to strike strategic targets inside Russian territory with U.S. provided weapons under certain circumstances. And there was another letter, statement by a U.S. Senator, a Republican, saying, look, we need to be able to do this, and the hits keep coming. Then yesterday we saw this, and I read it, I didn't actually play it, so you're going to hear the question and the answer.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask a quick question? Your colleagues from House Intelligence Committee, they just released a statement in which they're calling for administration to allow Ukraine to use American weaponry on the military targets on Russian territory. Would you support that? Because right now they have weapons, but they have restrictions to use that.
I think we need to allow Ukraine to prosecute the war and the way they see fit. They need to be able to fight back, and I think us trying to micromanage the effort there is not good policy for us. So
Okay, so he said, I think we should allow Ukraine to use the weapons as they see fit. We shouldn't micromanage it. This was Mike Johnson. It's got to be really jolting for people who have hated Mike Johnson for the last 8 months to see him actually supporting Ukraine now. If he is supporting this, if the Foreign Relations Committee is supporting this, and others are supporting this, it then puts the onus back on Biden to change the policy, because Biden's the one that has that power. I talked about this at some length with Greg Terry yesterday, and we're trying to make sense of why is this happening right now? And Greg was leading with this thing about China, and there's a report that China was perhaps providing lethal weapons to Russia, and if they are, that changes some things. Maybe that's causing it. And I was speculating that maybe it's something like, well, what do we do about glide bombs? Maybe that was changing it. We don't know exactly what it was, but I think we have a little bit more of an answer, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, this is the range of ATACMS, and so this is up into Belarus, and then this is pretty deep into Russia where the ATACMS can strike, and so that could be pretty significant, backing off the Russians. Here is the U.S. Congress showed a map of the Russian Federation with possible target zones for U.S. missiles in Ukraine's possessions. Marks with possible targets for attack can be seen on the map. So I'm going to let McCall speak. He's the chairman of the committee, and I'm going to let him speak. And he's first going to be talking about what happened with Israel, and then he'll pivot and talk about what needs to be done in Ukraine. So let's hear
If you
this.
decide to withhold more weapons from Israel, which I would say was the intent of Congress when we passed the supplemental and when I approved these weapons, will you at least give us advance notification?
Mr. Chairman, we've gone out of our way. We've gone well above and beyond in previewing for Congress.
I had no notification, nor did anyone in this committee or Congress until we saw the president on CNN. That's hardly an adequate way to notify Congress. Lastly, Ukraine. We have a really bad situation going on, as you know. This is a sanctuary zone that the Russians have created. And what they're doing is they're lining up all their artillery and rockets and missiles just across the Ukraine border that they then use to attack the Ukrainians. However, your administration and Jake Sullivan have restricted the arms use so that Ukraine cannot defend itself and fire back at Russia. That's why
and that's exactly what this policy does. It allows them to step 1 foot over the border and, sorry, you can't hit us with American weapons. Now, they have some Ukrainian-made weapons that they can use, so that doesn't actually happen, but still, they would back up in a big way if they were pushed back by ATACMS.
Mandated the ATACMS and the supplemental, the long range, short range, and the HIMARS, that your administration is tying their hands behind their back.
You might have missed that when I was making my comment. He said, he mandated in the bill that they have these ATACMS weapons for this purpose, and your administration is tying their hands behind their back.
Not unlike what you're trying to do in Israel. Will you change this policy so Ukraine can fight without one hand tied behind its back?
Well,
okay. And that's a great question. Will you change this policy? So let's look at just a little bit more, and then we'll talk about how to go about influencing this process. Okay, the State Department suggests that the White House allow Ukrainian armed forces to use American weapons for strikes against Russia, according to this New York Times article. So let's go to the actual New York Times article. Inside the White House, a debate over letting Ukraine shoot U.S. weapons into Russia. Since the first American shipments of sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky had to agree to never fire them into Russian territory. And I talked about this kind of thing in this video, what Biden is afraid of. And it's not a partisan hit piece. It really isn't. It's just like trying to understand, like, why does he hold this position? Why is he always worried about crossing Putin's red lines? Why is he self-deterring? And he fundamentally seems to have too low of an estimate of what the U.S. military or U.S. military weapons can or should do. Maybe in contrast to how President Bush might have thought too much of it and maybe had some hubris, he's almost pessimistic where Bush was maybe too optimistic. Okay, at any rate, let's get back to this. But the consensus around that policy is fraying. Propelled by the State Department, there is now a vigorous debate inside the administration over relaxing the ban to allow Ukrainians to hit missile and artillery launch sites just over the border in Russia. Yeah, they need to do that. The proposal, pressed by Secretary Antony Blinken, after a sobering visit to Kyiv last week, is still in the formative stages, and it's not clear how many of his colleagues among Mr. Biden's inner circle have signed on. It has not yet been formally presented to the president, so it's not about to happen. They have to work through this process to have all their ducks in a row, present it to Biden. Biden has to think about it. Anyway, it's not yet been formally presented to the president, who has traditionally been the most cautious. He is. That's just his knee-jerk reaction, is to be really cautious. But officials involved in the deliberations said Mr. Blinken's position had changed because the Russians had opened a new front in the war with devastating results. Moscow's forces have placed weapons right across the border from northeastern Ukraine and aimed them at Kharkiv, knowing the Ukrainians would only be able to use non-American drones and other weaponry to target them in response. For months, Mr. Zelensky has been mounting attacks on Russian ships, oil facilities, and electricity plants, but he has been doing so largely with Ukrainian-made drones. Now, the pressure is mounting on the United States to help Ukraine target Russian military sites, even if Washington wants to maintain its ban on attacking oil refineries and other Russian infrastructure with American-provided arms. That's fine. Keep that ban on those things. That's fine. Let them hit real military targets, including things so part of what's going on in Kharkiv is that a glide bomb can be fired from 70 kilometers away and still hit in Kharkiv, and there's no recourse. You can't can you shoot at that plane, or you can't, not with American-made weapons. Another hint of a shift came in recent days. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, in repeating the usual administration position, our expectation is that they continue to use the weapons that were provided on targets inside Ukraine. The aerial dynamic is a little bit different, Mr. Austin allowed. But what does that mean? When a reporter followed up by asking a question whether such aerial operations by the Russians were off limits or not off limits, Mr. Austin did not respond. Okay, so again, I'm not sure why Biden is so cautious, but they really need this to happen. Now, if you believe that this needs to happen, you can ask the president. Go to www, if you're an American citizen, whitehouse.gov, whitehouse.gov, and then you'll see a form like this, and you just type in what it's about, contact the president, and your name, prefix, and then your name, and I'm not going to go through the whole chart, I've already done it, and you can just work right down through the form, and then what would you like to say? Well, I've already written a script for you, I'll put the script below. President Biden, I appreciate your unwavering support for Ukraine and your commitment to keep American soldiers out of the war. However, the restrictions your administration has placed on Ukraine's use of American weapons may be unnecessarily prolonging the war. Ukraine must be able to hit targets inside of Russia. If not, the Russians will likely destroy or possibly take Kharkiv. Please consider changing this policy to allow them to strike at legitimate military targets so that Ukrainians can defend themselves. Thank you, and in my case, I put from a Republican who supports your position on Ukraine, Darin Gerdes. And then I click send, and it goes. And that's it. That's all you have to do. And if you want to do the same thing, I'll put that link below with my script, and maybe you can do the same. If you do, put it in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for likes, shares, subscribes, writing the president. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.